In 1939, the shipyards of the Third Reich put the finishing touches on the largest battleship ever built in Europe. It would be the most heavily armored and the most powerful, equipped with modern artillery capable of fending off attacks from the sea and the sky. This terrible machine was named the Bismarck. The battleship was to be sent on a North Atlantic mission to decimate the American cargo convoys that were providing Great Britain with supplies. Should the operation succeed, England, who had been alone in their fight against Nazi Germany for more than a year, would be cut off and brought to their knees. But the Royal Navy had no intention of letting this happen. Thus began one of the most formidable naval battles in history, and one of the turning points of World War II. "1,000 kilometers northwest of Brest, a massive shipwreck lies 4,600 meters below the surface of the sea. Despite a nearly 5-kilometer fall, the carcass is still relatively intact. Shrouding in mystery the life and death of the largest battleship ever built in Europe. The Bismarck. The gargantuan ship's adventure can be seen as an allegory for World War II itself. The tragedy of this massive ship explains the Battle of the Atlantic, the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's defeat in the Pacific, and the eventual triumph of the Allies over Nazi Germany. On February 14, 1939, in Hamburg, Adolf Hitler launched the Kriegsmarine's latest project into the sea with much ceremony. All the country's leading dignitaries were there. The granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck, a major supporter of German unification in the late 19th century, baptized the ship. Throwing a bottle of champagne on its prow, she proclaimed, "In accordance with my orders from the Führer, I baptize you the Bismarck." Thousands of people broke out into the sacred anthem of Deutschland über alles, Germany above all, which the Nazis translated as "Germany must rule the world." The battleship Bismarck was intended to help them achieve this world domination. And there's no point denying that the monster of steel had a lot going for it. It was 250 meters long and 36 meters wide. It had a draft of 10.2 meters. The maximum weight in combat was just over 50,000 tons, 40% of which was due to the ship's massive armor plating. The main armor belt was 320 millimeters thick, while the horizontal armor had a thickness of 110 millimeters. The plating on the main turrets was 180 to 360 millimeters thick. On the conning tower, it was 200 to 350 millimeters. The ship was powered by 12 Wagner boilers and 3 turbines made by Blohm and Voss. Together, they could produce up to 138,000 horsepower for a maximum speed of 30 knots. The Bismarck could travel 8,410 miles, more than 15,000 kilometers at a cruising speed of 15 knots. Adolf Hitler and many of the highest-ranking officers of the Kriegsmarine believed that the Bismarck and its sister ship, the Tirpitz, launched on April 1, 1939, would be able to overpower the Royal Navy. However, the British Navy was the best in the world at the time. It had an impressive fleet of 19 battleships, 6 aircraft carriers, 60 submarines, 150 destroyers, 80 cruisers, including 3 battle cruisers. The HMS Hood was the jewel of the English fleet.
The Hood was named for a notable family who had given many admirals to the British Navy, and the ship was the darling of the English people. It was designed by a brilliant engineer named Sir John Jackie Fisher, who had also designed the Dreadnought-class battleships. The Hood was like the big brother, or maybe the little brother, of the dreadnoughts, because it was approximately the same size and had approximately the same weapons. The difference was that it had less armor, making it much faster than the dreadnoughts. For the British, the ship's speed was intended to compensate for the relative weakness in the armor plating. They even said, "Speed is armor," speed is armor.
Even with the best Navy in the world, the Royal Navy had its work cut out for it in the middle of 1941. Its naval forces were split between 3 fronts: the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic, where it was protecting what it still could. In late 1940, England's factories were running at full speed, but the country was still under threat of a German invasion. The Blitz, the bombing campaign launched by the Reich in September 1940, was still underway, doing its best to demoralize the British population through massive attacks, which frequently caused firestorms. England needed everything from supplies to raw materials, fuel, weapons, and ammunition. Fortunately, Roosevelt had a new law passed in the US Congress.
The Lend-Lease Law was passed by the U.S. Congress in March of 1941, and it remained in effect until the end of the war, nearly the end of 1944. The law stated that the President of the United States could cede, sell, or exchange any kind of merchandise or goods to any country whose defense was considered vital for the protection of the United States. At this point in the war, it was a godsend for England.
After France fell, the United Kingdom had to rely on supplies from its colonies or the American continent for support in its fight against Nazi Germany. But first, those convoys had to reach the British ports. Hitler had realized that the Atlantic route needed to be cut off if he wanted to bring down his enemy. As a result, he launched Operation Rheinbung. It was finally time for the battleship Bismarck to make its entrance. It slipped into the waters of the Baltic Sea, with the Prince Eugene at its side. The 2 ships set sail towards their powerful, determined enemy, and towards their fate. The atmosphere on board was extremely tense. And just as the operation began, a strange incident took place that seemed foreshadowing for Admiral Lütjens, who was leading the Bismarck squadron.
During the fueling process, the hoses that connected the Bismarck to the pumping station gave out, and much of the fuel oil was spilled on the front starboard part of the ship. The refueling was never resumed, because Lütjens was in such a hurry. The operation was already underway, and he was eager to be out at sea. Therefore, the Bismarck set out with 200 tons less fuel than the 4,800 tons it should have had in its tanks. Those 200 tons would turn out to make all the difference.
The 2 jewels of the Kriegsmarine crown left the port of Gotenhafen and headed for the fjords and islands between Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Their destination was the Atlantic Ocean. where they hoped to sow chaos in the convoys en route to England. At 9 in the morning on May 21st, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen reached Bergen, Norway. At this point, the German intelligence service was still confident that the Home Fleet, the other name for the Royal Navy, had not left their port at Scapa Flow. The leader of the fleet, Admiral Gunther Lütjens, was not particularly worried, or if he was, he didn't show it.
Gunther Lütjens
was a cold, fearless leader and a man of few words. He was not very popular with his subordinates, notably the captain of the Bismarck, Ernst Lindemann, who didn't appreciate the condescending way he treated the crew.
At 1:15 in the afternoon, the alarm sirens went off on the battleship. Almost immediately, an airplane flew over the two ships at the Bergen anchorage. There wasn't even time to activate the ship's air defense systems, and the airplanes of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, stayed on the ground. Everyone was astonished. The secret operation might not remain secret for much longer. A Spitfire took pictures of the two German ships and delivered them to the British Admiralty. The Bismarck was clearly identified. Despite this incident, in Bergen, the Prince Eugen filled up on fuel to ensure it could travel further. For some reason, the Bismarck didn't refuel, remaining with 200 tons less fuel in its tanks.
It's one of the great mysteries of the tragedy of the Bismarck. Why didn't Admiral Lütjens refuel, even though he left his fleet in the anchorage for a whole day at risk of being seen?
By the time the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen finally left Bergen around midnight, the Kriegsmarine intelligence services had already announced that the Bismarck had been spotted by Norwegian resistance fighters several days prior.
Out of fear of attacks by enemy airplanes, the two swastikas that had been painted on the front and back of the ship were covered with paint, hiding them to make the Bismarck less of a target. Operation Reinigung had been completely exposed by this point, yet it continued on despite Hitler's reticence. Why? Because Admiral Lütjens was convinced that the English hadn't moved. In reality, he was sorely mistaken.
At the same moment as the two German ships left their anchorage, 250 kilometers away, the HMS Hood and the Prince of Wales also set out to sea. Unaware of this fact, the German admiral wanted to take advantage of the storm to reach the heart of the Atlantic unseen. On the morning of May 22nd, a Maryland light bomber braving the elements confirmed that the Bismarck had left the fjords of Norway. At 10:15 that evening, the HMS Suffolk set out from Iceland to join another heavy cruiser, the Norfolk, in the Denmark Strait. The HMS Hood, the Prince of Wales, and 6 destroyers left the Faroe Islands for the southern end of the strait. 1 hour later, Admiral Tove left Scapa Flow on board his admiral ship, the King George V. It was accompanied by 4 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, and the victorious aircraft carrier. The fleet would be joined in the Northern Hebrides the next day, May 23rd, by the battlecruiser Repulse and 3 more destroyers. Further south, in Gibraltar, the Force H, which included the Ark Royal aircraft carrier, prepared to lend a hand to its companions at arms in the home fleet.
On May 23rd, no fewer than 36 British ships were preparing to track the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. The home fleet had mobilized the majority of its forces to intercept and sink the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen in the middle of the North Atlantic.
On board the Bismarck, the atmosphere was tense. Any hope of reaching the Atlantic unseen had been completely destroyed. The battleship's hydrophones had already captured the sound of 2 ships, the Suffolk and the Norfolk heavy cruisers, whose signals on their radar systems would not be disappearing anytime soon.
At this point in time, the crew of the Bismarck was very concerned, because it was no longer a question of whether or not the ship would be intercepted, but when.
At 8:30 in the evening, the Norfolk emerged from the mist right in front of the Bismarck. The German battleship immediately fired off a spray of 8 380mm shells. The British cruiser managed to escape nearly 7 tons of steel that had been sent at it in a single salvo. The firepower of the German giant was astounding. The battleship's main weapon system consisted of 4 turrets, with 2 380mm cannons each, which were capable of firing shells with a range of over 35 kilometers. The secondary artillery system was designed primarily for fighting destroyers and had 12 150mm cannons mounted on 6 turrets. The rest of the battleship's artillery was just as impressive, with 16 105mm twin-mounted cannons, 16 37mm anti-aircraft cannons, and 12 20mm cannons.
But during the first wave of fire against the Norfolk, not only did the Bismarck fail to hit its target, but the blowback generated by the gunfire damaged the radar antenna at the front. The Bismarck was forced to cede its position to the Prince Eugène, whose detection system was still intact. The Bismarck was as good as blind, unable to determine the location of its adversaries in the North Atlantic.
That put it in a bad position, because while the Norfolk and Suffolk clung to its coattails, the HMS Hood and the Prince of Wales charged towards it from the southeast. Lütjens still wasn't worried, however, because the German intelligence service had not yet realized the British ships had set sail. He was still convinced he would be able to use the storm that was brewing in the Atlantic to slip through the net. He was wrong. In addition to the Hood and the Prince of Wales, 3 other ships of the line and 1 aircraft carrier were also headed for the Bismarck and the Prince Eugène. At 11:31 that evening, the Force H received orders to set sail from Gibraltar in order to provide protection for a large convoy of troops in the Atlantic. At 5:47 a.m., an alarm went off on the Bismarck. They were caught completely off guard. Just a few minutes later, the Hood and the Prince of Wales were 30 kilometers from the ship. When they reached 29 kilometers, they opened fire. The duel would last only a few minutes, but the Bismarck was slow to respond.
On the bridge, Admiral Lütjens was completely petrified, because until then, the German intelligence service had been telling him the home fleet hadn't budged. Yet the first shots that the Bismarck had managed to avoid were clear proof that there were ships of the line in front of him. He wasn't expecting it.
At 5:54, the Bismarck was struck by a shell from the Prince of Wales, which had reached its target from 24 kilometers away. But the German battleship still hadn't returned fire. The firing officer, Schneider, was raring to go.
Captain Lindemann was so exasperated by Lütjens' lack of response that he is quoted as having said, "I'm not going to let my ship explode under my ass."
At 5:55, the Bismarck group finally responded, concentrating fire on the Hood. By this point, the 4 ships were only 20 kilometers away. With its 4 batteries of 2 380mm cannons, the Hood remained a formidable enemy despite its age. Its weapons could pierce armor plating 491mm thick from 5 kilometers away, and 337mm thick from a distance of 15 kilometers. The projectiles took less than 30 seconds to cover this distance. They passed one another in midair The sounds of the battle were so loud, they were heard in Reykjavik, 500 kilometers away. At 6:01, the Bismarck and the Hood were just 15 kilometers apart. The Prince Eugen hit the HMS Hood. The fire was quickly contained by the crew, but the Bismarck's fifth salvo hit the bullseye. A shell weighing nearly 800 kilos found its way into the superstructure of the British ship, coming to a halt in a hold filled with ammunition. A column of fire 300 meters high suddenly rose into the sky, and a catastrophic explosion broke the Hood in two.
The ship sank in a matter of seconds. In an odd twist of fate, a short circuit triggered a last round of fire from the gun turret just before it sank for good. Only 3 people survived out of a crew of 1,415. England had just lost the Hood, its favorite ship.
At 6:06, the disabled Prince of Wales released a smokescreen and charged out of battle at top speed. 13 of its soldiers died. Lütjens decided not to pursue it.
Despite Lindemann's protests, Lütjens followed Hitler's orders not to get too involved with the home fleet, the British Royal Navy, which he knew was very powerful in the North Atlantic. But there was another reason Lütjens decided not to chase down the Prince of Wales. The Bismarck was unable to, as it had taken serious damage during the confrontation.
Two of the 3 356mm shells fired by the Prince of Wales had caused substantial damage to the ship. One of them entered the port side and exited through the starboard side, resulting in a 1.5-meter breach in the hull and allowing 2,000 tons of seawater to rush in, too much to pump. Even worse, a portion of the fuel stored at the front had been definitively lost.
The fact that Bismarck's fuel tanks had not been entirely filled in Norway, when they could have refueled, had an impact on the decisions to come and would influence the ship's tragic fate.
A small trickle of oil was spilling out of the breached ship's hold, spreading behind the ship. It had to be repaired as quickly as possible. At 8:01 in the morning, on May 24, 1941, Lütjens decided to make a significant detour to the west to reach the port of Saint-Nazaire, where he would have his ship repaired before resuming the operation. But London, once the fright had passed, had gathered reinforcements. The Norfolk, the Suffolk, and the Prince of Wales were still following the Bismarck on their radar, and Admiral Tovey on board the King George V was just 650 kilometers away. He wanted to bring the aircraft carrier the Victorious as close as possible to attempt an aerial attack. Other battleships, including the Rodney, were converging on the Bismarck from the center of the Atlantic, but the British still didn't know where the German battleship was headed.
That marked the end of Operation Rheinübung. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen split up. The Bismarck had to think about its survival, which was contingent on not being caught by its pursuers. So it counted on its speed of 28 knots, which was approximately the same as the British ships that were pursuing it. In theory, it shouldn't have been able to be caught unless something slowed it down.
But this game of hide-and-seek was somewhat lopsided. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the Sunderland seaplane from the Coastal Command spotted the trail of oil leaking from the Bismarck. The wounded ship was leaving tracks on the sea. In spite of all this, after their first unsuccessful attempt on the late afternoon of May 24th, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen managed to split up without raising the suspicions of their pursuers. Admiral Lütjens used the pouring rain as cover and turned the Bismarck abruptly starboard, briefly engaging with the group of British ships. Under cover of this brief altercation, the Prince Eugène split off to the west. Its sole mission was to harass the convoys of the Atlantic. At 7:50 that evening, the Bismarck resumed its original route. The 3 English ships were now off their port side. But a few hours later, a new threat would appear. The aircraft carrier, the Victorious, was just 193 kilometers away, bringing it within range for air raids. It was time for the English to intervene. The German battleship was approaching a zone where packs of U-boats might be patrolling. At 10:10 p.m., in the pouring rain, 9 Swordfish biplanes managed to take off from the bridge of the Victorious.
A lot of people considered that the Swordfish was out of date at the beginning of World War II, and in a sense that's true. But when it was designed in 1935, it was an extremely useful and good aircraft. Its speed was good for the day at 139 miles per hour, and its capability for carrying a torpedo was exactly what the Navy needed.
The technical specification of the Fairey Swordfish were length 11.0 meters, wingspan 13.87 meters, maximum mass at takeoff just over 4 tons, engine 690 horsepower Bristol Pegasus with a maximum speed of 222 kilometers per hour, combat load 3 227 kilogram bombs or 1 702 kilogram torpedo.
What would happen next was almost surreal. In the area, there was a small ship just 73 meters long, a third of the length of the Bismarck, called the Modoc, which was with the U.S. Coast Guard. The United States were not yet at war because it was May of 1941, and Pearl Harbor hadn't happened yet. But they were there to oversee rescue operations for convoys that had been attacked. At nightfall, all of a sudden, the sailors saw an enormous shadow, almost like a ghost, appearing out of the clouds of rain. The Bismarck was floating just past their ship. Just a few minutes later, as they were still recovering from what they had just seen, 9 swordfish flew right over the Modoc, skimming the waves. The sailors were shocked.
The young, inexperienced pilots from the Victorious had the wrong ship at first and almost launched their torpedoes at the HMS Norfolk before passing over the Modoc, with their hearts in their throats, then making a charge for the Bismarck. The battleship's anti-aircraft defense system went into action against the small planes, which were trying to get into a better position to launch their torpedoes. Despite the incessant gunfire, none of the attackers were hit, and 9 torpedoes were launched at the Bismarck. Only 1 hit its target, however. It struck the main armor belt of the ship without causing any substantial damage. The melee lasted just 15 minutes.
It's hard to imagine the courage of the pilots who had to face the elements and the Bismarck in open cockpit airplanes. They managed to survive everything: the anti-aircraft defense systems of the German battleship, the rain, the darkness, the cold, and the gusts of wind. And after completing their mission, despite their fatigue, they still had to land their planes on an aircraft carrier in pitch-dark conditions.
The English pilots did a remarkable job, but the Bismarck's flak turned out to be much less effective, especially the medium and lightweight pieces, which were too few in number and not powerful enough, making them completely unable to hit the airplanes flying at near sea level. Fortunately, the battleship had other tricks up its sleeve. It was midnight on Sunday, May 25th, 1941, and it was Admiral Lutyens' birthday. He was turning 52 years old, and to celebrate his special day, he managed to accomplish both a masterful strike and a rookie mistake. Lutyens knew his pursuers were moving forward in a zigzag pattern to avoid attacks by the U-boats, adjusting their heading by 30 degrees every 10 minutes. When they moved farther away from the Bismarck by steering to the port side, they lost it because they were outside the 20-kilometer range of their radar. But they found it again 15 minutes later when they steered to the starboard side once again.
So Lütjens came up with an idea. He repeated the maneuver that had enabled the Prince Eugène to escape its pursuers.
The German admiral gave the order to steer 270 degrees to starboard, hoping to break radar contact and end up behind his pursuers. The maneuver worked beautifully, and the Bismarck resumed its route towards France. At 4:01, the Suffolk was forced to admit it had completely lost track of the Bismarck. The English fleet scattered in search of its prey in vain.
The disappearance of the Bismarck was very bad news for the British Admiralty. First of all, because its own ships were running low on fuel. And secondly, because the Bismarck remained undetectable, and no one knew what its intentions were. Was it returning to Norway, or would it try to make it to France? There were only two remaining hopes. The Force H, which had left Gibraltar with the Ark Royal, and could intercept it in the North Atlantic if it aimed for France, and the HMS Rodney, whose captain was convinced it was headed for either Brest or Saint-Nazaire.
But the plan to neutralize the executioner of the HMS Hood was a fragile one. The Atlantic Ocean is vast, and the Bismarck, which was ahead of them and approaching the area protected by the U-boats and the Luftwaffe, was just as fast as its pursuers. The German battleship was clearly ahead in this race, but Admiral Lütjens was about to make a fatal error.
The German admiral didn't realize that he was outside his pursuer's radar range, and therefore should have maintained radio silence.
The radio exchanges of the Bismarck made it possible to determine its location by triangulating the axes of emission. On the morning of May 25th, the listening stations of England, Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland determined the direction of a message that had been transmitted by the Bismarck at 7:27. The Admiralty knew where the enemy ship was on the map. Unfortunately, on board the King George V, Admiral Tovey made an error of judgment. He concluded that the Bismarck must be heading for the Strait of Norway, where it would attempt to force the passage between the Faroe and the Shetland Islands. Tovey changed his heading, taking his ship further away from its objective, of which he had been within 185 kilometers. The Bismarck got away. But by the end of the day on May 25, 1941, the analysis of the radio emissions from the Bismarck had enabled the British to determine its destination, France. Unfortunately, the King George V was now 80 kilometers farther away from it, and several other ships, including the victorious aircraft carrier, had to abandon the chase due to a lack of fuel. Only the Norfolk, the Rodney, and the Force H under the command of Vice Admiral James Somerville, which was approaching the Bay of Biscay, still had a chance of intercepting it. But first they had to determine exactly where it was and get within range. At 4:30 on the morning of May 26, 1941, an announcement was made to the crew. "We will soon be reaching Ireland. Just 1/4 of the distance between Iceland and France remains to be covered. At the halfway point, we will reach the zones covered by our submarines, and the Luftwaffe should be there by midday."
Captain Lindemann was so sure of himself that he had the tops of the gun turrets repainted yellow in order to make it easier for the Luftwaffe to identify the ship, thus avoiding any unfortunate mistakes.
It would take a miracle to sink the Bismarck now. That miracle had a face and a name: Dennis Briggs. The Catalina seaplane from the Coastal Command, piloted by Briggs, took off from Northern Ireland at 3 in the morning. By mid-morning, Briggs spotted through the clouds a black shape on the horizon. The Bismarck. He transmitted his position under fire from the German flak. The battleship had been found. It was 1,296 kilometers from the port of Brest, which it could reach by the following day.
At around 11:30, the crew of the Bismarck saw two more airplanes fly over their heads, these ones with wheels. They weren't seaplanes, so considering their location in the middle of the Atlantic, they could only assume that these had come from a British aircraft carrier.
That aircraft carrier was the Ark Royal, which had traveled there from Gibraltar. At that precise point in time, it was the only ship from the Force H that could intercept the Bismarck with its swordfish. But nothing would go according to plan. On board the renowned battlecruiser, Vice Admiral James Somerville sent out a light cruiser, the HMS Sheffield, to tail the enemy ship. At the same time, he ordered a squadron of 15 torpedo bombers to be sent out. But the pilots had not been informed that they would be flying over the Sheffield. Even worse, their commander had assured them that the only ship that they would come across would be the Bismarck. All signs pointed to a potential disaster brewing.
The 11 swordfish from the Ark Royal targeted the wrong ship, and 6 torpedoes were launched against the Sheffield. It managed to avoid them, but 5 of the magnetic torpedoes exploded when they touched the waves. This blunder would have had a major impact on the events that followed, because at the same time, in spite of the storm, Vice Admiral Somerville decided to launch a raid and to equip all planes with torpedoes that exploded on impact. That would make all the difference.
Time was running short, and there was little chance of success. The Rodney and the King George V were too far away. The Renown and its 2 destroyers were too vulnerable. The English didn't know that a U-boat, the U-556, had been diverted to provide coverage for the last section of the voyage of the Bismarck, which had a chance of escaping its pursuers. At 7:48 on the evening of May 26, 1941, the U-556 spotted 2 large ships moving forward in a straight line. One of them was an aircraft carrier, the Ark Royal. It was a golden opportunity to strike against this giant vessel. But the German submarines were faced with a slight problem. They had no more torpedoes. All they could do was put out a call on the radio for other U-boats to join them there. But it was too late. It was almost 8 p.m., and a new wave of British planes had just taken off, despite the terrible weather conditions.
Very few aircraft would have been able to battle their way through the extremely poor weather conditions of that night and locate and find the Bismarck to be able to launch torpedoes and cripple it. The swordfish was incredibly strongly constructed. It could take a lot of flak damage, it could take a lot of bullet holes, it could take a lot of poor weather flying and still manage to get itself back to the ship. The swordfish has no canopy or cover or closed-in cockpit area. The telegraphist air gunner, or TAG, operated only a single Lewis K machine gun, but again, this was very, very small machine gun really for its own self-defense. The swordfish could fly almost touching the wave tops down to 20, 30 feet above the waves, and this was under the enemy fire. The Bismarck found that it couldn't range its guns low enough to shoot the aircraft, incoming aircraft, out of the sky.
This time, the pilots targeted the right vessel. Despite fire from the anti-aircraft defense system, they charged towards the battleship, which managed to avoid the first wave of torpedoes. But it would only take a single projectile to change the course of history. One torpedo hit the center of the ship, causing minimal damage. But at 9:14, another torpedo that could have missed the giant by a matter of centimeters exploded on the poop deck. The German battleship's tillers were blocked. At 9:40, the High Commander of the Kriegsmarine received a message from the Bismarck. The ship can no longer be maneuvered. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Admiral Lütjens remained as eloquent as ever.
At this point, the Bismarck was unable to escape, even though it was just a few kilometers from the zone that was secured by German submarines and the Luftwaffe.
As soon as he realized the Bismarck could no longer be controlled, Admiral Tovey on board the King George V put out a call for all ships to converge on their prey. The Bismarck was on the edge of the range of the Luftwaffe, but it was careening to the north like a wounded animal. Over the course of that night, 6 destroyers harried the battleship, organizing several waves of torpedo attacks. Despite the wild sea, the terrible weather, and its reduced maneuvering capacity, the Bismarck stood strong. At 11:56, Lütjens sent a message to Hitler. "We will fight to the end, believing in you, our Führer, and keeping unwavering faith in Germany's final victory."
At 1:53 in the morning, Hitler sent a brief response to Lütjens' message. "Thank you on behalf of all of Germany."
At 7:53 on May 27, 1941, the Norfolk appeared from the north-northeast. At 8:30, the Dorchester appeared and approached the Cossacks that were already on location. It was followed by the Rodney and the King George V. Launched in 1939, the King George V battleship was 227 meters long, 24 meters shorter than the Bismarck. Yet it had a powerful weapon system: 10 356mm cannons and 16 133mm cannons. Its shells could pierce 541 millimeters of armor plating at a distance of 5 kilometers, 385 millimeters at 10 kilometers, and 326 millimeters at 15 kilometers. The HMS King George V was accompanied by another older battleship, the Rodney, which was equipped with 9 406mm cannons. The firepower of the 2 British ships combined outclassed that of the Bismarck, which was unable to steer. It was in desperate need of help if it had any chance of surviving. At 7:57, the commander of the Kriegsmarine announced that 51 bombers had taken off and should be within view by 9. The Luftwaffe was on its way to help the Bismarck, but time was running out. At 8:47, the Rodney, some 20 kilometers from its target, fired an opening salvo. At that distance, the shells were in flight for some 50 seconds. The Bismarck responded, flanking the Rodney, but missed it by just a few dozen meters.
I can't imagine what would have happened if the HMS Rodney had been sunk. In addition to the home fleet losing one of the jewels in its crown, it would have proven that the Bismarck was still operational, and the whole operation to sink it might have been called into question.
At 9 o'clock, the commanders of the Kriegsmarine requested that the Bismarck identify the ships that it was facing to make sure that the planes that were on their way to help wouldn't make any mistakes. The Bismarck would never answer this message. At 9:02, 2 shells destroyed the center and front of the German battleship. Three minutes later, the firing station took a direct hit. The battleship had now lost its main armaments. By this point, Lütjens and Lindemann were probably already dead.
The bridge was like hell on earth, with fire and projectiles tearing through air and flesh. Anyone who made it to the bridge couldn't stay there for long. They would have had to have gone back inside the ship. And the sailors deep inside the Bismarck's hold, a majority of whom were stuck due to the heat expansion of the partitions and the hermetically sealed doors, were unable to get out. Most of them would go down with the ship.
At 9:31, another direct hit finished off the main artillery system. The 380mm cannons were silenced forever. The Rodney was just 7,500 meters away. 10 minutes later, the secondary artillery system was also destroyed. 57 surface ships and 8 submarines from the Royal Navy had taken direct part in the chase.
By 10, the naval combat was nothing more than a shooting exercise for the English. The Bismarck no longer posed any threat, as it was completely powerless to respond. Yet at 10:15 and 10:21, the HMS Rodney and the HMS King George were forced to fall back, as German submarines had been detected. The HMS Dorsetshire was charged with finishing off the German battleship. In just 1.5 hours, the Bismarck was targeted by 2,900 shells, representing 600 tons of projectiles and 16 tons of explosives. It took 300 hits, but it was still floating.
Struck by at least 3 torpedoes and damaged by scuttling explosives that had gone off, the Bismarck was listing to the port side and sinking at the back, taking with it hundreds of men who were stuck in the superstructures. In just 10 minutes, the Bismarck would be at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The turrets, which were not actually attached to the deck, separated from the rest of the ship and sank into the abyss. And the nearly 5,000-ton ship plunged into the depths like a steel knife. The hydrodynamic flows moving across the ship ripped the structure apart. The shipwreck finally stabilized on the slope of an underwater mountain, which it struck violently with its prow. The impact deformed the armored hull, which was several centimeters thick. As it sank, the battleship aspirated more than 100,000 tons of water in its wake, creating massive whirlpools that struck the ocean's floor and triggered an avalanche of sediment that the massive steel slid along for more than a kilometer. The wreck destroyed everything in its path, churning up the seafloor and carving a deep groove before finally settling into place. The immobilized monster was to be the last resting place for most of its crew. "2,000 sailors went down with the Bismarck. The youngest of them was just 18 years old. The British quickly organized a rescue mission. Hundreds of men had been thrown into the sea, which was covered with a thick layer of fuel. They were desperately clinging to life. The crew of the Dorsetshire threw them ropes so they could climb on board. The chaos of this moment marked the English crew all the more because they were suddenly forced to bring the rescue operation to a halt when U-boats were detected in the distance. At 11:46, the Dorsetshire sailed farther away, abandoning dozens of men to the sea. 116 men from the Bismarck were saved, and as the story goes, one cat that was named Oscar.
I believe that we can learn a lot from the Bismarck's tragic end. First, it heralded the beginning of the end for Bismarck-class battleships in 1941, and it also marked the beginning of air and sea combat. because it was the swordfish of the Ark Royal that changed the fate of the German battleship. The Japanese took inspiration from the swordfish when they were perfecting their torpedoes and preparing their attack on Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans in the Pacific worked to develop their air and sea combat. And it was the torpedo bombers of the U.S. Air and Sea Forces that would one day sink the two Japanese Bismarck-class battleships, the Musashi and the Yamato. The loss of the Yamato brought everything almost full circle.
The loss of the Bismarck was a huge hit for the Kriegsmarine. Its twin brother, the Tirpitz, would never get involved in the North Atlantic. It was destined to do nothing more than sail around in circles off the coast of Norway, acting as a boogeyman for the Allied convoys in the Arctic. Transformed into a floating fortress, it was sunk while anchored on November 12, 1944, by 6-ton perforating tallboy bombs. After losing the Bismarck, the German naval forces abandoned the strategy of engaging with heavy ships, preferring to focus on submarine raids in the Atlantic. In line with Admiral Donitz's way of thinking, packs of submarines charged at Allied convoys, marking the beginning of a new kind of naval combat.